You're listening to Nightmare Patrol, where every shadow hides a story, and reality is never as safe as it seems. Before we get into tonight's story, if you enjoy true horror, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel and keeps the nightmares coming. And one more thing, let me know where you're listening from, what city, what state. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. I'll start by telling you a little about myself. I'm a 26-year-old male paramedic living in a small town on the east coast of Canada. I'm about 6 feet tall and slim. As is common in my line of work, I've witnessed some pretty disturbing things. I've been a paramedic for 4 years now, and over time it's become well known among my colleagues that I handle all the psychiatric calls, or the crazy ones, however you prefer to call them. But before I begin, I need to say this: the brain is a very complicated organ. There are many mental illnesses recognized worldwide, but none are worse than what I call the phenomenon of evil. Sometimes the two can be hard to tell apart. It was a bitterly cold but calm September night when my partner, whom I'll call Jeff, and I got a pager alert to respond to a rural residence. A 49-year-old woman was reported to be having trouble breathing. Shit, I thought to myself. Our shift had just started, and I was planning to grab a coffee. Received dispatch, mark us en route, I muttered into the radio. Jeff and I had worked together for about 2 years, and I knew by the lines on his face that he could use a coffee just as much as, if not more than, I could. It was our 4th consecutive 12-hour night shift, and we were both starving for rest. I ignored the fatigue and settled into the ambulance's passenger seat as Jeff flicked on the lights and started driving. After a 9-minute drive down what seemed like the worst road on this side of the continent, we finally arrived. With very little traffic around, we switched off the siren and just left the ambulance's flashing lights on. Jeff gave me a playful wink and said, "Go get him, Savior." I'm sure I gave him a tired look while sarcastically flipping him the middle finger, then slid out the passenger door. Our destination was an old white Victorian house that would have been completely swallowed by darkness if not for the yellow light glowing from inside. What unsettled me was the pure darkness and emptiness of the long driveway stretching beneath my feet for at least 30 meters to the house's yard. Coupled with the dark sky and what seemed to be the moon's absence, there was something sinister in the air. I couldn't explain it. The stones and dirt beneath my feet creaked as I walked toward the ambulance's side door. Tossing the defibrillator strap over my shoulder, Jeff joined me and grabbed our bag filled with meds and oxygen gear. I quickly nodded my thanks, and we headed toward the house. As we neared the yard, a deep voice became audible. I couldn't make out the words at first, but there was no mistaking the tone. This person was agitated. I remember thinking how strange that was. Most people panic when they start struggling to breathe. I glanced at Jeff, who seemed just as puzzled. Someone might be in trouble, though. I kept walking toward the house, the voice growing clearer as we closed the distance until my boot hit the first step of the yard. That's when 2 voices broke through. "Man, you're a crazy bitch, you know that?" "Woman, fuck you, Will. They know you, and they hate you. They're gonna slit your throat and feed on you." Those were the first words I heard as I stood in the yard. At this point, it's fair to say I was completely scared out of my mind. What was even stranger was the second voice, which I soon learned was female, sounded almost inhuman. Like she was speaking through clenched teeth in a pitch far too high for a normal voice. I quickly looked at Jeff to give him the signal to run back and call the RCMP. With a single nod, he began silently retreating toward where we'd come from. Almost like a curse, a large branch snapped under Jeff's boot. Immediately, the voices stopped and the front door slammed open, banging against the opposite wall and exposing me fully. A big, burly man stepped through the door and scowled at me, but then a slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. He was balding but made up for it with a thick beard. This guy must have been at least 64 and weighed 300 pounds. He looked just over 50, but looking back, his body showed many classic signs of abuse. His wide grin revealed 7 front teeth that seemed to be rotting from the inside out, and his skin had taken on a yellowish tint. "Well, what do you know? You actually showed up? Took you long enough. I called over 10 minutes ago. My wife's acting like a crazy bitch." Behind the man, I caught a glimpse of the woman watching the scene. Unlike her partner, she was no taller than 5 feet. She had dark features and was likely of indigenous descent. Her face was twisted in an exaggerated look of disgust. I wouldn't dare turn my back on these two for fear of my own life. Calmly, I said, "Hello, sir." My partner and I received a call about someone possibly having a medical emergency. Also, the police were notified and are on their way. What seems to be the problem? Man, I just told you. My wife's acting like a damn lunatic. Look, I can help, but if you keep cursing at me, you'll have to deal with it on your own. What's your name? Man. Sorry, man, I have no patience for this woman. Call me Will, and she's Miriam. At this point, Miriam started yelling every curse word she could think of at him. Mom, I need you to calm down. This isn't helping the situation. Let's take it step by step. My name is Tom, and I'm trying to help both of you. Slowly but hesitantly, I motioned to Jeff to keep prioritizing the call to the RCMP. Contrary to what I'd just told this man, the RCMP was not on their way. Will motioned for me to come inside the house. For some reason, I felt a certain level of control over the situation, and confident enough to enter his home. I dropped my defibrillator just outside the door and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It reeked of sulfur and stomach bile. The second thing was the woman who immediately tried to shove me back out through the very door I had just entered. Miriam. No, they told me he was coming. They don't like him, they want him to die. As I fell backwards, Will was quick to position himself behind her, grabbing both her arms and wrapping her in the biggest, most imposing bear hug I've ever seen. Will, sorry about that, man. Can't say I didn't warn you. As this tremendously large man held this small indigenous woman, I couldn't help but let out a small laugh until my eyes darted to her face. Her eyes were bloodshot and twitching violently. She wore the widest, most sinister grin I'd ever seen. The curve of her smile stretched almost 3/4 of the way up her cheek. At that moment, Jeff heard the commotion and came into the house to ask if everything was okay. He took me aside into the next room and told me that the local RCMP was responding to a domestic disturbance a few kilometers away, and the closest unit wouldn't arrive for at least 35 minutes. We were really out in the middle of nowhere. Damn. I quickly asked Jeff to take Will aside and get his side of the story, including any medical history Miriam might have, and whether they had been using alcohol or drugs. I also asked him to collect any knives or weapons that might pose a threat. When Jeff and I returned to the living room, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Miriam's sinister grin had softened into a surprisingly charming and captivating smile. Though still unsettling, I felt relieved to see that her manic episode seemed to have passed for now. While Will and Jeff searched the house, I decided to stay alone with Miriam, since there were no visible weapons. Surprisingly, Miriam seemed confident enough to open up to me. Here's roughly how our conversation went. Miriam, I started feeling unsafe in my home about 3 days ago. I was sitting in my chair. She pointed to a red armchair in the next room when I heard a scratching sound coming from one of the walls. I thought maybe we had rats again, but when I pressed my ear to the wall, I realized it was just a very faint whisper. Me. Have you heard voices before? Anyone else in your family? Miriam gave me a nasty look, but it didn't seem threatening. I'm not crazy, if that's what you're trying to get me to say. Me. No, Miriam. You're misunderstanding me. As a clinician, I have to make sure I have all parts of the story. That's how I can help you best. She seemed satisfied with that and continued. Miriam. No one in my family is crazy. Not like that, but I grew up on a reservation, and people used to tell me stories about the shadow men. She seemed increasingly animated as she went deeper into the story, and I found myself strangely drawn in by what she was saying. Miriam. But I never managed to find those voices. I even went around to the other side of the wall, but the whispers had stopped. That night when I was sleeping, that's when they visited me for the first time. See, Will and I have been having a rough time lately, and he was sleeping on the couch, which was probably a good thing because we'd be dead if they saw him. They don't like men. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a beer bottle falling off my bedside table. I thought maybe Will was trying to make a little love. Boy, was I wrong. I think my heart almost jumped out of my chest. There were 4 of them standing in a semicircle at the edge of my bed. They were tall. Very tall. They had to bend their necks or they'd go right through the ceiling. Me. What did they look like? Miriam. Well, they had 2 arms, 2 legs, if that's what you mean. But they're tall and colorless. They weren't black, but my room was really dark and they kind of blended in, though I could see things like the color of the pictures on the wall. But I could see their shapes, just not their color. They weren't dressed either. That sounded like a very deep hallucination to me. Miriam. Then they started talking in really sneaky voices about how I'd have to prove my worth to them. We talked for hours, but at some point I must have fallen asleep because I woke up the next morning with no sign of them. I told Will, but he just called me a bitch and told me to hold my drink. That's when I started feeling very uneasy. She looked me straight in the eye, her smile widening again, and her voice changed into someone else's. Miriam, they told me about you. They visit me and tell me about you, Mr. my last name. I stepped back from her. I wasn't sure how she knew my last name. After talking to Jeff about it later, I was pretty sure he found it funny that it hadn't occurred to me that my paramedic ID showed my paramedic number as well as my first and last names. At that moment, she lunged at me, screaming something like, "You can't escape them." As a paramedic, I'm legally allowed to use necessary force in these situations, so I managed to pin her to the floor, though not without getting a swollen lip in the process. I yelled for Jeff to come upstairs to help, but before he could respond, I heard the familiar sound of a siren in the distance. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking there was a way out of this nightmare. That relief quickly turned to terror when my fingers found a knife shed hidden in her pants. The RCMP arrived shortly after and took the woman into custody. My partner and I decided she was too dangerous to ride with us in the ambulance. Before we left, Jeff took me upstairs and showed me something that still gives me chills to this day. Nearly every wall was torn up as if someone had battered them with an iron bar or some large object. The house insulation was hanging loose in several places. On every wall, in every available space, this woman had written, "The shadow men are coming." In one corner, almost hidden behind a toppled shelf, was a drawing of 4 tall humanoid creatures reaching for what appeared to be the chest of a smaller humanoid. They were tearing out its heart. As we prepared to leave, Will thanked us. We got back in the ambulance and I caught a glimpse of Miriam's all-too-familiar smile out of the corner of my eye. She was staring through the squad car window, clutching her chest and making a gesture like she was ripping out her own heart. When I got home to my wonderful partner, who's very understanding of my career choice, I gave her a big hug and collapsed onto the bed. I really didn't want to get into the details of what happened that night. That was a story for another day. I had the next 5 days off. My wife then snuggled up to me and handed me something before mentioning how forgetful I can be sometimes. It was my paramedic ID. I had left it at home. I'm an EMT in Arkansas. I work the night shift in a rural part of the state, and most of our coverage area is mountainous and heavily forested. We got a 911 call from an elderly woman who had found her husband apparently dead. In our area, EMS usually arrives first on scene, since paramedics are authorized under protocol to confirm death in the field. The location of the call was about 55 minutes deep into the surrounding national forest, a nearly uninhabited area. We followed our GPS until suddenly it stopped showing our route. The road we were on wasn't listed on any paper map, wasn't on the GPS, and didn't show up on our phones either. We were out in the middle of nowhere with no GPS, no signal, and no contact with dispatch or the sheriff's office via radio. We decided to turn back, but the road was so narrow that the ambulance was scraping against trees as we tried to reverse. It was basically an ATV trail. We spent about 30 minutes backing up while my partner guided me so I wouldn't hit anything. Eventually, we reached a small clearing wide enough to turn around and start heading back the way we came. As we drove, I noticed something in the road. I pointed it out to my partner as I slowed down. The figure started moving toward us. It looked like a man dressed entirely in black. We sat there for about 30 seconds, just staring at him, and he stared back. The whole time we were both whispering, "What the F, what the F?" Then without a word, the figure turned and pointed toward a small side road we hadn't noticed before. It was completely dark, and it didn't show up on the GPS. We tried to call dispatch and the SO for backup, still no signal. We decided it must be a neighbor trying to help us find the house, so we followed the direction he pointed. In my head, I could hear banjo music. I was already thinking about how badly this could go. I've been on calls like this before where someone snaps and tries to stab us when we get close, or someone's tweaked out of their mind and wants to kill us for our narcotics. Eventually, we reached a small trailer. By now, we were over an hour away from the nearest highway. Later, we learned that dispatch had been panicking trying to reach us. They couldn't even see our satellite tracker on the map. We slowly approached the trailer. Inside, we found an elderly woman sitting on the floor next to a body. The body was the same size and build as the figure who had pointed us down that road. We checked the man. He was in full rigor mortis, meaning he'd been dead for several hours. We comforted the woman for a moment and asked if she had any neighbors. She said the closest one lived about 7 miles back the way we came. We confirmed the death and asked if she had a phone. Using her landline, we called the sheriff's office so the county coroner and investigators could respond. When the officers arrived, we asked if they'd seen the man who led us there. They said no. They just followed our tire tracks through the mud. My partner and I left. We never talked about it again. To this day, I still get chills whenever we get a call out in the forest. My brother is a paramedic, and in the city where he works, protocol requires a police officer to accompany paramedics to scenes involving violence. One day, the police called for medical assistance after spotting a naked, blood-covered man wandering the streets screaming at passing cars while holding a knife. When my brother and his team arrived, a police officer briefed them on the situation. The man had reportedly been dragging 2 naked children along the road and had tried to throw them into oncoming traffic. Miraculously, the children were unharmed. After that, the man ran down the street yelling at vehicles. The officer called for backup to confront the man, and my brother contacted the fire chief to send more personnel, both to care for the children and to be on standby in case any officers were injured. Within 10 minutes, 5 police officers, my brother, his partner, the fire chief, and 2 additional paramedics had arrived, 10 men in total. The police managed to convince the man to approach the ambulance to assess whether he needed immediate medical attention. They placed him on a stretcher and loaded him into my brother's ambulance for evaluation. Inside the ambulance were my brother, his partner, and the original responding officer. The moment the door closed, the man turned violent. He punched my brother square in the nose and lunged for the officer's gun. Both my brother and his partner hit the panic buttons on their radios, sending out an emergency alert to all nearby units. The officer managed to get 1 handcuff on the man, but he couldn't secure him to anything. This guy had unreal strength, likely from being high on methamphetamine. Then the back doors of the ambulance burst open, and the remaining 4 officers, the fire chief, and the 2 paramedics jumped in to help. It took all 7 of them to wrestle the man down. The fire chief was struck in the mouth with the swinging handcuffs, and even with 10 people, they barely managed to subdue him. 2 officers eventually used their tasers, and they were finally able to strap him down to the stretcher. He was sedated on the spot, and 2 officers had to ride in the back of the ambulance with their tasers drawn, just in case he tried anything again. Once they arrived at the hospital, every single person who had been in contact with the man officers, paramedics, everyone, was quarantined in a secure ward for several hours. It turns out the man had been exposed to hazardous chemicals while cooking meth in his apartment. Anyone who touched him could have been contaminated through their clothes. Remember how he was found naked? Well, so were his wife and kids. He had been manufacturing meth inside their apartment. When his wife told him to stop, he beat her so badly he ended up covered in her blood. Enraged, he decided to kill his children. He dragged them outside, and that's when the police confronted him. Now, I don't know much about drug laws, but apparently, if you're caught cooking meth in an apartment complex, you're charged for endangering every person in the building. This man lived in a complex with over 100 residents, so that's 100 charges for endangerment, plus assault on officers, aggravated assault, resisting arrest, 3 counts of attempted murder, and manufacturing methamphetamine. He's facing an enormous sentence.